All right, this week's question of the week is my thoughts on the Ecological Jiu-Jitsu teaching method. And that sounds like a mouthful, but apparently it's the latest drama on debates in the Jiu-Jitsu community as to whether this is a good teaching method or a bad teaching method. And so I'm going to tackle my thoughts on the Ecological Jiu-Jitsu teaching method. So what I know about this teaching method is it was created by a guy named Greg Souders. And I met Greg probably about 10 years ago at Dave Jacobs' Jiu-Jitsu Academy, which was in the Washington, D.C. area. Greg probably doesn't remember me. It was just a quick meeting. I didn't even have a beard back then. I was still active duty military. But I met him, and I had a great impression of him. I don't know him personally, but I know his instructor who awarded him his black belt, Dave Jacobs, who was a phenomenal Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu teacher and an incredibly nice man, and in my opinion, the best referee the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation ever had. So I always knew if Dave was refereeing one of my matches, it was going to be well called and you'd get a fair shake. Just an incredible man who, unfortunately, Dave Jacobs passed away several years ago. But any black belt under Dave Jacobs, I know is absolutely legit, and that's my thoughts on Greg's background. Also, I know that I've never actually trained at Greg's Academy. I think it's called Standard Jiu-Jitsu, and it's in the Washington, D.C. area. But I've had two of my closest friends who have trained at his academy. One of them was one of my purple belts, Josh O'Day, who trained with Greg and raved about Greg. Had nothing but great things to say about Greg and his training. And another was recently one of the black belts, one of our military guys who was stationed here for 3 years, and then he transferred to the Washington, D.C. area, Isaac Henderson. And Isaac was both a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and a Judo black belt, and he trained with Greg and raved about Greg. So I've only heard good things about Greg Souders and his training. But like I said, I've never personally trained with him. I'm not going to try to explain what Ecological Jiu-Jitsu teaching method is because I don't fully understand it. Not that that's wrong or good or bad. It's just I haven't studied it enough to really give a good opinion, and I would do a disservice by trying to explain this teaching method to you in this short video that I'm creating here. So I'm not going to try to do that. I will put a link below on Greg's webpage, and I'm pretty sure he's got a YouTube channel, and you can study up if you want to learn more about the ecological teaching method for Jiu-Jitsu. So I know there's a lot of people that have come out and said, they're totally against it. They don't agree with it. They're like, hey, this is the way we've always done it. No reason to change. We're having great results. And so they think this guy's wrong. And that happens every time a new change or a new idea comes along. There's going to be people will be immediately against it because, well, this is the way we've always done it. And I'll give you a couple examples. One was a very famous purchase that was derisively called Seward's Folly. And Seward was the Secretary of State, and he was Secretary of State during President Lincoln and President Johnson, and he led the purchase of Alaska from Russia. And I think it came out, my history could be wrong, but I think it came out to about a $7 million purchase, which I don't know what would be, the value would be in today's dollars, but at the time I think it was a $7 million purchase. And smart people that were into investments, people that were into government, many of them thought this was ridiculous, and they nicknamed it Seward's Folly. Like, it's such a bad idea. It's just ridiculous. Plus a lot of things were going on in America at that time, and it's like, we shouldn't be wasting $7 million on the purchase of this frozen land that's not good for anything. Turns out was a lot of gold and a lot of oil in Alaska, and it became one of our states. And nowadays, nobody calls it Seward's Folly. Everybody agrees that this was a great deal. But back in the 1860s, when this happened, people were not convinced this was a great deal. They thought it was a terrible deal. Same, and when you're teaching jiu-jitsu or whatever you're teaching, you should always be looking for better ways to teach that subject. Constantly. But anytime you introduce new ideas, new ways to teach, three possible things could happen. One, turns out to be a better way to teach. Two, it turns out to be just as effective as our old way. Or three, it turns out to be not as effective as our old way. But the only way you're going to know is try. And so a lot of times, we're not happy with the current results we're getting. Like, for example, U.S. education system. In 2022, they came out with a ranking, in the United States, out of 81 countries, our math for our students was 34th. We finished 34th out of 81 countries, which most people are not okay with. They're like, how can we be the wealthiest country in the world? We have all this technology, all these resources, and we're 34 out of 81. We're barely in the top 50. Like, how can that be? Well, what the schools did is they started to look at more effective ways to teach math. And this has been an ongoing problem. This isn't a recent thing. And so one of the things that they did was they introduced like a new way of teaching math. And I've seen it. My kids have done it. I've looked at it, and I'm like, man, this ain't like math in my day. It's different. I had to learn this new way of doing math. And many people have been totally against it. They're like, hey, we've been doing math like this forever. It works great. Why are we changing? This new math makes no sense. And then also the schools were started giving more homework. And then parents came, oh my gosh, you got to let kids be kids. You're overwhelming them with the homework. Blah. Just a litany of excuses and complaints. Don't like the new way of doing math. Don't like more homework. This has made us totally unhappy. The problem is if you're not happy with being number 34 out of 81, if you're not happy with that country rank, then you're going to have to find a better way to do things. Either I don't really like when people say work smarter, but find better ways to do things, or you're going to have to work harder. Both of which we have shown that we have no appetite for either. We don't like the new math system, and we don't want our kids working harder. But we don't like the fact that we're number 34 out of 81 countries. If we stay the same, if we continue to do math the way we've always done it, at the same, working just as hard as we've always done it, no more, no less, we will continue to get the same results that we've always gotten. But honestly, we'll start to fall back even further amongst the other countries as other countries innovate and or work harder. They will continue to surpass us because we're continuing to do what we've always done, and we're somehow expecting a better result. It's like, no, if you continue to do it the way you've always done it, you'll continue to get similar results to what you've always gotten. It's not going to get better. So then you have to do a little soul searching. Are we okay with being number 34 out of 81 in math? Or are we willing to learn this new way of doing math that may be better, as good, or worse than our old way, but there's only one way to find out? Or are students working harder with less time on their video games. I know that sounds unimaginable, but there we are. Less time on social media, less time on video games, which I think would be a great idea, but hey, that's our debate. So I link and I give those analogies to tie back into what Greg is trying to do with his ecological jiu-jitsu teaching method. It's different than what we've always done. Is it better? Don't know. We'll have to see if it's better or as good or worse than what we've always done. But what people will come out with, it's like, oh no, this is the way it's always been done. There's no reason to change. And the irony is, especially with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, when the Gracies and other Brazilians started modifying Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, people in Japan were like, hey, no reason to change. This is the way it's always been done for centuries. There's no reason to change. Just continue to do it this way. But most people today would agree that the innovations that the Brazilians brought to Jiu-Jitsu was amazing and created a whole new art that is incredibly effective. So change is hard, and people usually only change when the pain of changing is less than the pain of remaining the same. So when the pain of changing becomes less, or when it becomes more painful to remain the same than the pain of the change, that's usually the only time people were willing to make a change. So I would say, check out what Greg Souders is doing at Standard Jiu-Jitsu in his ecological jiu-jitsu teaching method. And don't get caught up, because I saw one argument online where somebody's like, well, this school is creating all these ADCC and world champions in a greater number than what Greg has created at Standard Jiu-Jitsu. So clearly his method is not as good. That's a false argument, because one, you have to look at what the demographics are. The school they was comparing Greg's method to was a school where people, their full-time employment was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's what they do. They're competitive Jiu-Jitsu athletes, and that's what they do. That's their full-time employment. Where, don't know for sure, but I would assume Greg's demographic is somewhat different, just because the two students that I knew that were training with Greg were both active duty military. So they was doing their full-time employment and then on their off time training jiu-jitsu. And so if the demographics of a school is, the full-time employment is military, law enforcement, medical, construction, auto mechanics, you can't compare that to a school where their full-time employment is just doing jiu-jitsu. That's not a fair comparison. To say, well, these results are better than these, so clearly this system is better than that. No, this system, it's got more time doing it. So, like I said, I don't know what the demographics are for Greg's school, and we have to look at that before we start comparing and saying, well, one way is better than the other because of results, because we don't really know. And usually when you're implementing a new system, you're not going to see the results right away, because you have to learn that new system. It may take a year, 2, 5, 10, before we can fully appreciate whether it's more effective, just as good, or less effective. So that's my thoughts for this week's question of the week. Keep your minds open to change. Life is all about change. And if you stay stagnant, you're going to fall behind. So if you got any comments or questions, feel free to comment below. Until next week, ciao. Oh, turn off my hand.